and good afternoon, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for hosting it and for inviting me to be a keynote speaker. It is a great honor and privilege to be a speaker in this Max Havelaar series, the third year of this presentation. I think the theme, Chains for Change, is very appropriate. I'm speaking to you as a researcher, somebody who's looked at these issues over a number of years. And there are two sets of researchers that come together to do work on this topic. One type of researcher is somebody who's come out of development studies. That's my case, where you'd be looking at specific countries, different countries, and you try to figure out how to promote development in those places. And one of the things you always had a sense of as a development researcher is a country is inserted in the global economy. How a country can improve its position has to do with understanding how the global economy works. The other kind of researcher that's very important for this work are people who are looking at the global economy from the top down, people who are understanding the big corporations, the global industries that are actually controlling the fate of many countries and people in the world. So hopefully in this presentation, and certainly with this topic, I want to bring those two types of research together. I want to cover several topics, and I'm going to do it quite briefly because Rob has wanted to keep things moving and have plenty of time for question and answer. So first, I want to just give you a very quick orientation to how globalization has dramatically changed the world economy in the last 3 decades, so that instead of just talking about big multinational corporations like we could have in the 1970s, we need to talk about global supply chains and how that affects the kind of issues that are being considered here in this conference. Second, the whole issue of free trade and fair trade has been posed frequently as a kind of two polarities. But in fact, in almost all the global industries we're interested in, there is no free trade. It's all managed trade. And so we need to understand how global industries are governed. And so I want to talk a little bit about how academic research has framed those issues in terms of the governance of global value chains. Then I want to go to a micro level and say, what does this mean for actual jobs in the global economy? And I want to give you an idea of some research that's been going on in a network of folks, beginning with some ILO work on global production networks and decent work. And then I'll give you a little insight into a research project that the ILO has sort of spawned with a large group of researchers that I'm a part of in this jobs area. So the issue is, how do we link economic upgrading and social upgrading? Then I want to go to a macro level, and I want to look at this from the point of view of countries. I want to use the comparison between China and Mexico to give you an idea of how this is also working out in terms of global industries. I want to then look at this from the larger lens of not just economic upgrading or improving economic progress, but what does this mean for these broader sustainability issues? How do we link economic and social and environmental upgrading? And that's a big challenge right now on the academic horizon. A lot of work's being done in that area. And then finally, I just want to say a word about how the current economic crisis has been changing the landscape in ways that academic researchers have to take into account. For this year's event, there's an excellent background paper with the title of the conference called Chains for Change that Professor Van Tulder wrote. It's on the website, I'm sure, of the School of Management and the Max Havelaar Institute. And in that paper, he poses 5 dilemmas or ambiguities or dimensions in the global economy. And I want to highlight them because I want to try to address these 5 in the context of my discussions. One is the polarity between free trade on the one hand, fair trade on the other. How do we move towards fair trade? A second dilemma or ambiguity is between prescription and description. One of the things you see in academic work that's looking at these different global industries is very fine-grained analysis of what's happening in certain countries or in certain industries. If you're looking at coffee and you want to understand how the players, the coffee exporters are changing, and then Vietnam comes in and it swamps the market with huge amount of Robusta coffee, what does that do to all the other kinds of players in that chain? You have to do a lot of thick description to just say what's happening. But the real challenge is how do we go from description to explanation? And how do we start to be able to predict changes? So I think we're starting to make progress in that area in terms of work. I'll speak to that a bit. There's also a polarity between what we might think of as producer-driven supply chains and buyer-driven supply chains. The producer-driven chains, like in the automobile industry or the aircraft industry or big integrated manufacturers. The buyer-driven chains are a fairly new phenomenon, but extremely important for fair trade issues. Those are the big supermarkets, giant retailers like Carrefour or Walmart, big brands like Nike, Disney, et cetera. Those companies control global supply chains to a much greater degree than an IBM or a General Motors ever did in the past. And so we need to understand how those two kinds of systems work, basically who's driving the chains. Then there's a dilemma between regulation and self-regulation. In the academic literature, this is referred to sometimes as the difference between public governance and private governance. Public governance is the things that governments do. We're familiar with that sphere. But because so many of these industries are global and they're crossing all kinds of national jurisdictions, national regulations don't work very well anymore. So in response to that, we've had a set of things called self-regulation or voluntary corporate codes of conduct that have been regulating labor issues and environmental issues. And the question is, how effective are those latter? But certainly they're key parts of the way global industries work. And finally, there's a tension between what might be called liability and responsibility. If you think about it from the corporate social responsibility end, it's this question of what motivates corporations to do corporate social responsibility. Are they just trying to avoid risk or minimize risk? Or are they actually trying to promote positive social change? So all of these themes are very relevant. They're important. They cross-cut a lot of the work that's being done. So I want to just try to refer to that in my comments. So real quickly, a sense of maybe a 30-second view of the global economy. If you went back to the 1970s, two things were important. One, the global economy was largely made up of pretty self-contained national economies. If you looked at the US or big European countries, most of the goods that were consumed in the country were made in the country. And the amount of goods you were importing might be 10% of your total consumption basket. If you look now at the US, if you look at the footwear industry, the television industry, the cell phone industry, we're importing 90, 95, up to 100%. No televisions are made in the United States anymore. Almost no athletic footwear are made in the United States. Virtually everything is being done overseas. Now that process of going from a world economy dominated by national economies and big integrated multinational firms to a world economy dominated by international trade and production networks, that's been created by several trends that have been well analyzed in the business literature. One of them was called outsourcing. Outsourcing just meant that companies that made things, for example, handed off what they were making to third parties and said, you make it for us and we'll focus on areas that we think we're best in. Besides outsourcing, there was a second phenomenon called offshoring. You started to do those same things in other countries because you could lower cost. Those two trends, outsourcing and offshoring, have led to a fragmentation of global industries that we now think of as these global supply chains or these global value chains. So it means individual companies that in the 60s or 70s, they might have had subsidiaries all around the world, but they owned those subsidiaries. Now, you have companies that are just focusing on their brand, focusing on their R&D, focusing on a much narrower set of core competencies, and the whole industry is an international production network where trade knits things together. That's a fundamental change. One of the implications of that is if you've been moving much of your manufacturing offshore, as Europe, US, Japan have done, maybe only 10% of the manufactured goods that any of those developed countries consume are actually made in those countries, and even then it's just some pieces of it. That means that the places that are making these goods, primarily Asia, a lot of Latin America, a lot of Africa, those we're building up what's called a global supply base. Those global suppliers in these different countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America are becoming much better at what they do. In fact, they're becoming even better than the suppliers that are left in the advanced industrial countries. So that scenario really means that if we start thinking of the world in terms of these global supply chains, we have these two sets of issues we have to analyze. One is the governance. How are the supply chains organized? Who controls them? Who sets the terms for everybody else, especially for these suppliers? And the second set of questions is the bottom-up question, upgrading. If you're in this world economy from any other part of the world, how do you improve your position? And it's not just Guatemala or Haiti or Sierra Leone that has to worry about that, but it's North Carolina in the United States or different regions inside countries. So everybody's kind of confronting this dilemma. Now, if we switch and just think about national development for a moment, again, if you were in the 1960s, 1970s, most countries around the world, developing countries, pursued something called import substituting industrialization. They invited multinationals to come in to supply the domestic market. National governments pretty much determined the conditions under which multinationals would come in. Today, we've got a completely different model that's called export-oriented industrialization. It happened in the mid-1980s. It was partly as a result of the success of first Japan, then South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the so-called East Asian Tigers, at promoting a new development model. But then the World Bank and the IMF got behind this and basically said, anybody that wants to receive loans from our institutions has to move into this export-oriented model. You have to follow this free trade idea, lower your tariff barriers, reduce the size of government, cut social programs, and basically let economic factors determine what's going on. So that was a major shift in national development, and it basically meant also that governments played a smaller role in what was actually happening. Corporations played a bigger role. It's another reason why these supply chains are so important. Finally, in this kind of world, this export-oriented world, one of the key measures of national development wasn't income distribution in a country, wasn't what you could make, it's what could you export. And you were typically exporting only parts of a final product, so it meant from the point of view of national development, if you're a country like Mexico, your most successful firms are going into the export business, nobody's paying attention to the domestic market, incomes can be going down domestically even though exports can be going up internationally. So you started to have a situation of global integration and kind of national disintegration or national fragmentation. So from a development point of view, all of this globalization and development created huge tensions that have been analyzed. And it also placed a premium from a work point of view on skills, different kinds of skills. So when I started sociology and went into economic development, the term development was what was used when you talked about countries, what Mexico or China or Morocco. You want to know about national development. Now people talk about upgrading because people are looking at global industries rather than national economies. And you can talk about upgrading in terms of products. You could make simple products or more sophisticated products. We also think about upgrading in terms of industries. The traditional idea was that developing countries started out producing primary products or extractive goods, minerals, agricultural products, oil. And they moved to labor-intensive manufacturers, then to more sophisticated manufactured goods like cars, and eventually to knowledge-intensive industries. So that's another way we'll think about upgrading. You'll see that in the Mexico-China case. We can also talk about roles. You can assemble goods. You could do what's called integrated manufacturing or full package production, or you can do you can do your own brand name, original brand name manufacturing, original design manufacturing. That kind of a trajectory is another way to think about upgrading or moving up the chain, moving up the value chain. And finally, we can talk about capabilities, moving from production to design to your own brands. So let me quickly give you an idea about chains. And now that when people are looking at these global industries, they're creating charts that look something like the chart up on the screen. The middle part of that chart is a traditional supply chain. You just start with the raw materials. Out of those raw materials, you make some key inputs, finished products, you distribute them, and you get them to end markets. So if we were talking about clothing, the raw materials could be cotton, or it could be silk, or it could be wool. That whole middle part of the chain is tangible goods. What's interesting about that chart is that the production, whether it's a car, a computer, or a sweater, it's in the middle of the chain. It's not at the end of the chain. So it really means that the point of production is only part of the value added here, and that once you make a good, especially since most of these goods are being made in developing countries for developed country markets, you've got a huge amount of value added that's occurring after production. And the question is, who's capturing that? Who's doing the processing? If you think about chocolate, you think about cocoa coming out of Ghana or Ivory Coast. The fact is, most of the value added to that cocoa or to the coffee is being done in Europe or is being done in the US. It's not being done in the places that grow it or the farmers that are making it. And that's a huge development issue. But in terms of value added, and the reason this is called a value chain, not just a supply chain, is that there's lots of other services that get added on to that production process. And those are things that are in that top set of boxes. So you've got research and development, you've got design, you can have logistics, finance, branding, marketing, lots of other ways to add value. So these studies are trying to figure out who's doing that, who's not only creating the value, but who's capturing the value. And typically that value isn't going to developing countries. And then at the bottom, you have a set of supporting industries. And there's a big literature on value chains. Michael Porter used to talk about them, but more from the point of view of firms. This is from the point of view of industries. Now, I want to come back to the difference between description versus explanation in these industries. I wrote an article with two colleagues, a guy named Tim Sturgeon at MIT and John Humphrey at the Institute of Development Studies, where we tried to come out with a broader set of categories for how these global chains are organized. And we talked a little bit about free trade and markets. Well, markets is the one on the far left. In most industries, except undifferentiated commodities like corn or wheat, don't even look at all like markets. They're all managed by big companies at the end of the chain. So this kind of a typology in a descriptive sense, markets are on the left, and on the right-hand side are something called hierarchies, which just means big vertically integrated firms. But most of the action in global industries is in the middle, in what are called production networks. And these networks are organized in different ways. You can have captive networks where certain suppliers primarily produce or sell to a final end product. You see a lot of that in the automobile industry, a lot of that in the computer industry. A hard disk drive maker might be selling 80% of what it does to one or two computer companies. You see relational chains, which basically means that a lot of information is going back and forth. The fashion apparel industries like that. Every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, a new set of designs are coming out, going to suppliers all around the world. They have to buy new cloth, new material. So nobody really has the power there is much more balanced between the two sets of players, the buyers and the suppliers. And then you have something called modular chains. If you think about the computer industry, hard disk drives, keyboards, all those things that can be produced and just handed off to the final producer, they're made like that. Now, that was a descriptive model. This, in the article, we identify sort of three variables, which are across the top there: complexity of transactions, ability to codify the transactions, or be able to give instructions, and the capabilities in the supply base. And the article was trying to say that according to those three variables, if you just give each one a high or a low, you can actually predict which kind of governance structure is going to exist. So in terms of research, since these things are constantly changing, the supply base might be becoming more sophisticated, or the ability to codify might go from low to high, then that changes the way the chain is governed. And the reason that's important is the way the chain is governed affects whether or not you can upgrade, how you move up the system. So this is a sense of how academics think about it, and this is an application of that kind of thinking to a specific industry. This is a study of the fresh vegetable value chain in Africa selling to UK supermarkets. The interesting thing about this is if you think about a supermarket like Tesco's or Sainsbury's, they're constantly changing the requirements for the growers of green beans or other kinds of vegetables. It's got to be cheaper. It's got to be faster. You've got to start doing different kinds of packaging. Then the growers all have to be certified so that they can be classified as organic or whatever. You're pushing more and more responsibility over time onto the growers. Now, what that does and so part of what researchers do is researchers go in there, they talk to the Sainsbury's, they talk to the growers, they go to different countries, and they first figure out how are these requirements from the lead firms, those firms at the top, how are they changing over time? Which countries is the product being produced in, and how are the growers responding to that? Well, what this research found out, it was done by two researchers, Catherine Dolan and John Humphrey, was that you actually, coming out of West Africa, had two very different chains. If you were selling to big supermarkets that had large orders, you had to have big firms that were able to do that, could afford to do all of those things that the supermarkets wanted. And not only were they big firms, but they were typically firms owned by European expatriates. They weren't even locally owned firms. But if you're selling to greengrocers or other sort of retailers at the top of the chain, you have a completely different governance structure. So part of the reason why this research is so useful and important to your objectives in terms of fair trade is the ability to get fair trade institutionalized depends partly on the requirements that these big buyers are producing, and then partly on the support system that farmers have to be able to comply with those. Now, let me quickly say something about how this is affecting jobs. After 1989, essentially the global labor market doubled. The dissolution of the Soviet Union brought Russia, Eastern Europe, China, and India, for different reasons, each place, into the global economy. Multinational companies began moving supply bases there, not just manufacturing facilities, but also service jobs. So about 3 billion workers moved into the world economy after 1990. When you couple that with the technological changes multinational corporations were able to use, you really had a single global labor market and increased competition from all over the world in terms of conditions of work. And business strategies of multinationals were typically pushing towards lower cost solutions. Move operations wherever you could save money. So that was an enormous change. If you look at this in terms of a jobs perspective, we really had 4 types of jobs, just generally speaking. This comes out of some ILO studies that I've been involved in, and so there's more work on this. One is you had assembly jobs. A place could just import parts, hire cheap labor, and sell it out again. That was the kind of first stage for countries. Then you had something that was called full package or integrated production. East Asia was really the region that pioneered this. This was tied to these big buyers, the retailers and brands that basically were looking for places that could make clothes, toys, sporting goods, all of that very effectively. So that was more sophisticated kind of jobs. Then you have these advanced production jobs in industries like electronics or automobiles. That's involving highly skilled technicians, engineers, and the like, also being done in developing countries. And finally, the newest thing we're starting to see now is global service jobs, the whole rise of what's called the knowledge economy, which isn't something that's just staying in Europe or the US or Japan anymore. Those jobs and R&D centers are moving all around the world. A project that we're just now beginning, that the ILO sort of sponsored with that Global Production Networks and Decent Work, has been funded by UK's DFID, the Department for International Development. And basically what we're trying to do in this project is we've got an example of 5 types of industries. This project is going to deal with agriculture, labor-intensive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and services. That's going across from left to right, the different columns. And then the different, in each column, we have different types of work, beginning with homework, assembly work, and going up to the knowledge-intensive work, the white square at the top. The key thing here is that in different types of industries, we have all skill levels represented. The only thing that's really differing when you're moving from agriculture to services is the relative proportion of work. So from a decent work or social upgrading agenda, you've got unskilled or home workers in every one of these industries, and you've got highly skilled workers. The question is, how do we deal with those across industries? And I think the challenge for academics was to come up with a framework where you could talk about agricultural home workers in the same way you could talk about apparel home workers. That sector isn't as important as moving across these sectors. And in this kind of a situation, the vertical axis is what we might think of as social upgrading, better standards of work. Right now, the ILO has what they call a decent work deficit, meaning social standards are low, so it's below the horizontal axis. And from left to right, you've got these different types of work, so it's economic upgrading increases as you move from left to right. And these scenarios are just reflecting the fact that we have trade-offs in terms of how these things can be advanced. You can socially upgrade the least advantaged workers, let's say the home workers, that's line C, that's kind of a one situation. On the other hand, you could promote economic upgrading, but might not have a lot of social upgrading. So for example, if we think about knowledge-intensive workers, the gaming industry in South Korea, the IT offshoring industry in Mexico, Nokia cell phones, much of that work is actually workers hired by Adecco or Manpower Inc. on 28-day contracts that from the point of view, unpaid overtime, extremely long hours of work. So I think one of the things we want to get across is knowledge workers and agricultural workers and manufacturing workers all have to be analyzed in the same way in terms of decent work issues. It's not like if you're a knowledge worker, you're suddenly out of the woods and you don't have to worry about that. So let me quickly move to a macro level and give you a quick insight into a China-Mexico comparison. They're interesting because these would be 2 of the most successful exporting countries in the world. Both of them have exported a wide range of manufactured goods. They both focus on the US market. But the bottom line is China, in the last decade, has been outcompeting Mexico in a massive way. And one of the questions is why. This is a map of Mexico's exports to the world over the last couple of decades. There's 5 types of industries. The yellow line is primary products. Then the green is resource-based manufacturers. And the bottom 3 categories, red, blue, purple, are low-tech manufacturers. Think of that as apparel, footwear, toys. Medium-tech manufacturers, think of that as automobiles, automobile parts. High-tech manufacturers, electronics. Mexico kind of represents a typical upgrade development pattern from a Latin American point of view. Primary product exports decline as a percentage of the total. That was oil and minerals. And manufactured goods go up. So Mexico's top export over the last 15 years has been medium technology goods, autos, followed by electronics. So from a point of view of upgrading types of industries, this is a success story. Mexico's also increased the amount of exports in recent years to about $300 million. $300 billion. This is China. China has focused on manufactured products. The line at the top has been low-tech manufacturers. So it means China got its start with apparel, toys, sporting goods, all those things you'd find on a Walmart shelf. But look now, the most important export item is electronics, high-tech manufacturers. So one of the things this is showing us is the old model of development that was sequential. You start with agriculture and primary products, then you move to low-tech manufacturing, then high-tech, and then you get into the services. Doesn't hold at all. China is doing all of those things simultaneously. Mexico is doing many of those things simultaneously. It's just that China is doing it in a more effective way than other countries. This is the market share in the US of imports for apparel and computers, just to take 2 products. Over the last 8 years, you can see that China's share of the US market has grown dramatically. Mexico's has fallen. And Mexico's number 2 or number 3. Same thing for computers. So China's doing the same thing in low-tech and high-tech. They haven't moved out of apparel. They haven't moved out of any of these. And when you look at internationally, China's the largest purchaser of soybeans, for example, from Brazil. They're the biggest investor in Africa in terms of construction. So China is becoming a massive differentiated player. The way to think about this, let me just give you a low-tech, high-tech example. If you look at textiles, one of those low labor-intensive manufacturers, the value-added curve, in the middle is production. That's very little value added. The value added is what's called the pre-production and the post-production phases. China's setting up supply chain cities for industries like apparel, furniture, and electronics, where they're doing everything. They're doing the design work. They're increasingly doing R&D work. They're doing the branding. So that's the kind of name of the game. It's this idea of somehow reintegrating production. But the other thing that places like China and India and Ireland and other places doing, they're getting into the R&D business as well. The big multinationals are saying we can't find enough engineers, we can't find enough computer scientists. So the possibility of doing real innovation in developing countries is growing. So it means that when we're thinking about global supply chains, decent work, and upgrading, we've got to be looking across the whole spectrum, agriculture, manufacturing goods, and these high-value services of the knowledge game. And that's, I think, the newest phase of research on these global value chains are global services, tourism, business services, IT services, these R&D labs, what's really going on. If you sort of said quickly, why is China gaining market share? It's not just a low-cost story. It's not a low-wage story. China has always been looked at. And China, India, a lot of those countries, Turkey, we could put in the same category. It's not just about low wages anymore. China has economies of scale and scope. They've got an upgrading strategy, a strong role for government. So even though the rest of the world has had to kind of pull back on industrial policy, China's been able to have an industrial policy because they're so big, and they've used multinationals to try to tap the domestic market as well as to export. So there are China climbing this value chain in different ways, but the one thing we have to be careful of is that high-tech exports, like in electronics, doesn't necessarily mean high-value added production. Let me just close on China with an example from the iPod. The iPod, all iPods sold in the US, consumed in the US, are made in China. China does the assembly. They do it in a factory that's about 300,000 workers, owned by a company called Foxconn, a Taiwanese worker. The interesting thing, this is research that academics have done where they broke apart a $300 iPod, 450 parts, and they said who made each one and how much was the value added. They found out that Apple got $80 of that $300, but solely for intellectual property. Apple doesn't make anything. Apple's a design company. Some of the Japanese manufacturers actually made the biggest manufacturing parts, like the hard disk drives, and maybe they got $40 or $50 a piece. And they said, how much does China get for assembling all of those iPods? It was $4 per unit. So China is getting about 1% of the value of the iPod. So even though they're doing high-value production, they're doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily leave a lot of value for China. And if you think about it in the context of the current crisis, China's unemployment has been going up dramatically as well. So even the successful countries have been hard hit by the crisis. So it brings us to this last topic of whether or not sustainable development is possible in places like China. And just quickly, I think we need to bring together the sort of three dimensions of sustainability, not just the economic upgrading, like I was referring to with these different industries, but also the social and environmental upgrading. We have to have ways of measuring each of those, and academics have kind of focused on a variety of variables of the sort that are mentioned up there. But we have to sort of look at different places how those indicators are actually working out. So I want to close around this notion of actors and partnerships. In other words, who is responsible for pushing these chains towards upgrading directions? One actor is governments. Governments are outside the chain I was describing in terms of the firms and the way the chains are set up. Governments can certainly provide better information to citizens, consumers, and small and medium enterprises about products, labels, and markets. And they do that in different ways in different places. Some are much further along than others. They can also help small players in the chain, the smallholders in the farming area or small medium enterprises, to become certified because increasingly international standards are critical to be a player in these industries. They can promote and enforce good environmental and labor regulations. In fact, a lot of times countries have good regulations on the books. They're just not being enforced to create a market for standards. And they can support sustainability objectives by linking with international organizations. And I think the ILO has a really interesting project in Cambodia where they're enforcing a decent work agenda. But there's another really growing important area of partnerships, and that's between NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and corporations. Now, if we were to say, what are the conditions that would actually support a sustainable outcome, I think there's three that are critical. One, you have to identify big corporations that have a big impact on social upgrading through employment, direct and indirect, but also through their impact on the environment. Two, you have to be sure that those corporations see a business case for CSR. It could be a reputational case, it could be lots of ways, and I think there's been great work done actually by Rob and his colleagues on reactive, active, and proactive CSR strategies for showing that there's a range of ways to make a good business case. And then finally, you have to have agreement that whatever you come up with in terms of good practices gets disseminated through the rest of the industry. And there's a few of these that are going on. There's more than I have listed, but they're all interesting because these are corporations that are financing work together with NGOs to deal with what we would call sustainability or social upgrading issues. Cadbury did a very important study of the cocoa industry in Ghana. It was initially motivated because of concerns about child labor. But in fact, the most long-term interest from the Ghanaian government was about livelihoods. There weren't enough farmers or young farmers going into the business. So how do you make farming of cocoa more attractive so that becomes a sustainable industry economically and socially? Oxfam America is working with Coca-Cola, following on a study that Oxfam UK and Oxfam in the Netherlands did in Indonesia, focusing on poverty reduction, water use, and entrepreneurship in El Salvador and Zambia. And in particular, with entrepreneurship, they're looking at women in the supply chain. How could you promote the use of women entrepreneurs? And finally, there was ETI was focusing on this code of labor practice, and they really wanted to know, are workers really benefiting from these labor codes? And it was a very systematic study done with some academics. And what they found was, yes, some workers were benefiting, but the workers who benefited were the so-called regular workers that had contracts. And they were improving health conditions, wages, et cetera. But the irregular, casual, or seasonal workers weren't benefiting. So this is the kind of work that I think corporations have been helping to sponsor that shows what's really happening on the ground. And the final slide, if you were to say, okay...
Your slides are on strike here, so...
okay, right, this is the last one. The global crisis has been affecting some things in important ways if we look to the next 5 years. One is that I think that whole export-oriented model I mentioned that was sometimes called the Washington Consensus, that's ending. That probably ended in 2005 or so. We're moving to some newer model. It's going to be more multilateral. There's going to be a greater role for large emerging economies, but we still don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But there's going to be a different kind of global governance structure. I think the national development models are also changing, not just China, India, but other big countries are reasserting themselves in terms of industrial policy, focusing on the domestic economy, not just export industries. I think global value chains for sure are becoming more consolidated. Every big firm you talk to says, instead of dealing with 300 suppliers, I want to deal with 30. And those 30 have to be more capable and they have to be spread in strategic countries. So what does that mean for the countries that are losing? A big thing is I think regionalism is on the rise. Economic supply chains aren't going to just be global anymore. They're going to actually be regional, North American, Europe, North Africa, East Asian, and that's going to affect the ability of countries to improve their position. And finally, I think back to those jobs issues, upgrading in all these industries is requiring higher skills. And the question is, how do you help workers in different countries get those higher skills? So those are some of the thoughts on it. Yeah.